John Croy, Cranston, Jack Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Wrapping up my raving about Volume 13, Card Sharks. There's 2 stories left, and I wanted to give myself ample time to rave about them because I think they're both very good. This book really doesn't have any duds, I don't think. The last 2 stories in the book, one of them is by Kevin Andrew Murphy, who at that point had already contributed some characters that had already appeared in some previous books, like Cameo and Heron the Huntsman. Greg wanted me to mention Heron the Huntsman, the Joker, who is very formidable, essentially a Joker ace, has a very formidable superpower, and Greg wanted me to acknowledge that I failed to mention Hearn the Hunter when I talked about Volume 11. Not only a very formidable Joker ace, but also apparently has a very formidable anatomic advantage that does him well in his career as a erotic film star. And I guess I can leave it at that. But that character, along with Cameo, who also appears in Volume 11, both created by Kevin Andrew Murphy. Hearn the Hunter actually appears on the cover of Volume 11, both the original Bantam edition and the new Tor edition. Hearn is on the cover of both, which is pretty cool. That must have been kind of a cool thing. Like if you're a young author who's hasn't contributed any prose to Wildcards yet, but your character is on the cover already. It's pretty neat. And Kevin Andrew Murphy, though he had not contributed prose to any of the canonical Wildcards volumes, he had contributed writing to a role-playing, and again, my lack of role-playing of RPG vocab fails me or betrays me because I don't know what you call it, but it's a book. I've got it in the other room. It's called Aces Abroad, which is also the title of Volume 4 of the books. But this is Aces Abroad, a gaming RPG module campaign. I don't know the language, but Kevin Andrew Murphy wrote that, which is not canonical, but is pretty cool. And my friend John, who I often name drop. Hopefully I can maybe get him on one of these episodes if he feels like shooting the breeze about Wildcards. I don't think his love of Wildcards has persisted the way it has for me for whatever reason, that 30 years later I'm still obsessed with the books. I don't think John still is, but maybe he is. I'll have to ask him. So hopefully I can get him on an episode. But in the meantime, I will say that John was very impressed with Kevin Andrew Murphy's contribution to Volume 13. And I think I have this memory that he even was when he lent the book to me, he had already read it and he was lending it to me, and he was like, "Wait till you get to this one story near the end by Kevin Andrew Murphy. That's a good one." And so it's always kind of stuck out in my mind as I think because it was singled out by my Wildcards mentor John as a great one. But it holds up for me when I reread Volume 13. It really holds up as a really great entry, and it's set in 1962, and introduces a character named Nick Williams. His ace name is Will-O-Wisp, so he's an ace private eye. Once again, another example of a profession where ace kind of can take on 2 meanings. An ace private detective who also has ace powers. A bit like Jay Aykroyd in the present day, but this is a character who, unlike Jay, is based in Los Angeles rather than New York, and his career is in the 50s and 60s rather than Aykroyd in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, Nick Will-O-Wisp Williams, Los Angeles-based private eye in the 1960s, and so he's brought in because Orson Welles believes that someone is trying to sabotage his film called Blythe, aka Blythe Van Rensselaer, who is Rensselaer, I don't know how you say it, who, as we all know, is the character from Book 1, Tachyon's first love, whose mind was shattered by a combination of her own power and Tachyon's meddling and the pressure of the HUAC trials and all that. So Orson Welles in 1962 is making a movie about the HUAC trials of the 50s. Marilyn Monroe is playing Blythe Van Rensselaer, and a lot of other. There's a lot of name drops in this one connected to just that era of Hollywood. James Dean, I think James Dean is playing Tachyon. I think there's a couple. There's also a gag about Ron Eli playing Golden Boy. Not to be pedantic and explain the joke, but Jack Braun, the real Golden Boy, is the guy who starred in the Tarzan TV series in the 50s in the Wild Cards universe, whereas in the real world, that was Ron Eli who played Tarzan. So the joke is that now Ron Eli is playing Jack Braun, kind of putting things in a circle. So there's real world cameos like Ron Eli and James Dean and Peter Lawford, and the Robert Kennedy makes an appearance, although that's a little more than a cameo because it's kind of a plot point. But it's one of the things that I always found striking about the story is that up to that point, the Wild Cards universe tended to, if a character was going to really be a main character in a story, they changed the name. The example that always comes to mind is the Jim Morrison analog, The Lizard King from Volume 1 by my man Vic Milan. They don't call him Jim Morrison. They change his name to Tom Douglas, but they still call him the Lizard King, and his band is called Destiny instead of being called the Doors. So just enough changes to make it like, any similarities are coincidental, but obviously the similarities are not coincidental. But but yeah, rather than using the real name. But in this book, it's pretty like, it's not an Orson Welles analog. It's Orson Welles, and it's not someone where we're meant to be like, oh, I get it, that's supposed to be Marilyn Monroe. It's just Marilyn Monroe. They just call her that. And Robert Kennedy and John F. Kennedy are there, and Hedda Hopper. Just the real people. Which, they did do that before. I guess like you think of like Nixon and John Rankin and all those HUAC people. It just seems a little more intense in this one. And I have no idea how the legalities of that work. But it's like Marilyn Monroe, she's just a character in the story. But it does add this like extra element of, it does feel more intense somehow, like the fact that it's like it's not a stand-in with a pseudonym to give them the freedom to do what they want with the real life person. It's just the real life person. I don't know how that works. I should ask Kevin Andrew Murphy why that's sometimes allowed and why it wasn't, but it makes the story stronger. Whatever the reason, it makes the story more like, whoa. So he's there to act as to investigate the seeming attempts to sabotage the film. I don't remember if I even got that far in explaining the premise, but the card sharks want to sabotage the film because the film paints wild cards in a positive light, and the card sharks don't like that. And Pan Rudo is Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist, and he, of course, is a card shark. Hedda Hopper, the gossip columnist, turns out that she's a card shark as well. So Nick Williams is hired by Orson Welles to investigate these apparent attempts to sabotage the film. The entire story, there's, of course, this sort of, you're kind of waiting for it to happen, where it's like, oh, Marilyn Monroe, she's going to overdose, but it's going to be because Pan Rudo is her psychiatrist, and the overdose won't just be an accident. It'll be something that was calculated by Pan Rudo in order to sabotage the movie. But there ends up being some twists and turns before you get to that point. So it seems like it's kind of predictable, like the ending is going to be inevitable with the death of Marilyn Monroe. But yeah, there are some twists and turns before it gets to that ending, and things don't go the way you might assume. And then there are also some Wild Cards related cameos. So in addition to the 1960s Hollywood cameos, we get some appearances by some younger version of some familiar Wild Cards characters, including Tom Douglas, the Jim Morrison analog. There's a young version of him on the scene. There's also a young version of the character Tom Quincy, who I know when I first read the book, I was like, that's somebody, but who is that supposed to be? But it's Tom Quincy is Quinn the Eskimo, who we meet in Volume 7, I believe, for the first time, affiliated with the Shadow Fists and this sort of wild card chemist. He creates the drug rapture, which is an important plot element of some of the earlier books. So yeah, Tom Quincy is Quinn the Eskimo. And there's another character who I think I can thank Greg for pointing this one out to me, because it's another one that I missed, but it's a character named Flat Top, who is just this one-page joke from Volume 5, who I didn't get it at all. Greg was kind enough to explain it to me. He's a character who, well, he's called Flat Top, and he shows up in a Walter John Williams story, and he's got this sort of weird physical qualities. There's a bit of where he like screws a Coke bottle into his arm in order to just kind of like, I guess, mainline Coca-Cola. And he's got like strangely colored eyes. And yeah, Greg was the one who had to explain to me. It was like, here come on Flat Top. He got juju eyeballs. He shoot Coca-Cola. You get it now? And I was like, oh, yes, now I do. I did not get it then. Yeah. So here come a Flat Top. He got juju eyeball. He shoot Coca-Cola, et cetera, et cetera. I can't remember how many different lines from the song are acknowledged or are referenced, but now that I know, I love it, and I'm a little embarrassed that it didn't twig it without someone pointing it out to me. But so yeah, Flat Top makes it in there. There's a couple other surprises in there. So yeah, it's real. It's a very rich story, both in terms of the way it sort of plays off of our knowledge of what really happened to Marilyn Monroe in the early 60s in real life, and her relationship to the Kennedys. It's definitely over the top, and it puts me in mind of the bit in A Life Less Ordinary, when Ewan McGregor is talking about the book he's going to write about the secret love child of Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy. And every time he tells somebody his premise, they're like, it's a little obvious, isn't it? And he's like, it's a trashy book. It's supposed to be obvious. Hopefully Kevin Andrew Murphy won't be offended by that comparison, but yeah, it's definitely Murphy kind of indulging that kind of over the top secret conspiracies and scandalous love affairs with Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedys, and the whole idea, it's implied very strongly that the card sharks were responsible for the Kennedy assassination, and plotting the seemingly accidental overdose of Marilyn Monroe, and then the assassination of Robert Kennedy years later, et cetera, et cetera. So, and there might be a secret love child in Kevin Andrew Murphy's story. So, yeah, I think Ewan McGregor, the Ewan McGregor character in The Life Less Ordinary would be proud of this particular entry. Cursum Perficio is the title of the story, and then last but not least is Laura J. Mixon, who writes a story called The Lamia's Tale. It's set in 1968, and that's the one that pretty much, out and out says that in this world the card sharks were responsible for the assassination of Robert Kennedy, which all but just flat out says that, well, they probably were responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy too. That's never flat out stated, although I think it is pretty darn strongly implied. I mentioned that the book came out in 1993, which was the 30th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and it was definitely in vogue at the time to do conspiracy stories that sometimes would just be like some incidental little sidebar, like, here's this evil conspiracy, and incidentally, yeah, they were responsible for the Kennedy thing. Not even necessarily the main thrust of the story, but just throwing it out there, like, oh yeah, there's this evil guy who's been doing evil things for 30 years now. And yeah, he's also the guy who killed Kennedy. The Wild Cards, they certainly were not above hopping on that bandwagon, I guess. The 30th anniversary bandwagon of all that hullabaloo. So, but it works. I think it actually works, and it's a genre book, so it's a little obvious, but it works for me. But anyway, so Laura J. Mixon writes the story set in 1968, set right around the time of the Robert F. Kennedy assassination, and that whole event is it doesn't happen on the page, but it's very central to the events of the story. The other cool thing about the Laura J. Mixon story, one of many cool things about it is that it sort of delves into the Van Rensselaer dynasty, the Van Rensselaer family. Kevin Andrew Murphy's story, like I said, Marilyn Monroe is playing Blythe Van Rensselaer, who dies in book one, but her presence always kind of has loomed large in the series. We meet Fleur Van Rensselaer in volume 6, and Tachyon has pines over Blythe. In just about every installment of the series, we see Tachyon kind of pining over the lost love. But that the original story with Blythe, it established that she and her husband Henry had 3 kids, Fleur, who the adult version of whom we've met, and then Henry Jr. and Brandon. And so, in this story set in 1968, we get a story that's Brandon Van Rensselaer is a very important character. It's established that he's a card shark, as was his father Henry. This story is from the point of view of Joan Van Rensselaer, who is the wife of Brandon. So the Van Rensselaer family starts to become this kind of intriguing sort of dynasty within the Wild Cards world, which I always thought was very cool. And Brandon is also the man who hires Saran to assassinate Robert Kennedy on behalf of the Card Sharks, ordered to do so by Pan Rudo, because once again Pan Rudo is an important presence. And Brandon also ends up cheating on Joan with, wait for it, Marilyn Monroe, which I guess does spoil the fact it's 1968 and Marilyn Monroe is still alive, and a member of the Card Sharks. Spoilers. But is she really loyal to the Card Sharks, or is she actually playing them? Because we also know that she has some romantic entanglements with John F. Kennedy, and quite possibly some romantic entanglements with Robert Kennedy as well. So, is she working on the side of the Card Sharks, or is she really on the side of Robert F. Kennedy? In which case, she would be absolutely against the Card Sharks' attempt on his life. So that's some of the intrigues that are part of the Laura J. Mixon story, along with a lot of other interesting little character beats. There's also, I feel like every story, probably not every story, but many of the stories in this book give you little cameos of familiar characters, but like their younger versions. Like I mentioned, young Mark Meadows appears in the Michael Cassett story, little like 6-year-old Mark Meadows, the teenage version of Quinn the Eskimo and Tom Douglas, et cetera, et cetera. And this story features a young Greg Hartman. So it's 1968, and he's not yet Senator Hartman; he's Councilman Hartman, and we get a little brief. It's very cannily done. I love the way that Mixon writes the scene. Essentially, a little throwback to Puppet Man, who was already doing his thing in 1968, taking puppets here and there, and so it's a neat little nod to the Wild Cards franchise's most beloved villain, I guess. But yeah, Joan Van Rensselaer is the lead character in the story, and she's very well drawn. I think the Mixon story is it's her first, like with Kevin Andrew Murphy. This is Laura Mixon's first contribution of prose to the Wild Cards canon, and she hasn't written much over the years for Wild Cards. She contributes again to volume 14. and she's contributed online to one of the online stories, on Tor.com. And I think that might be it. As far as prose, she's contributed characters, of course, as all Wildcards authors have, but I think that might be it. Which is a shame. I think she's really good, and she's really, based on the 3 that she's done in Wildcards, which I realize is not a huge sampling, but she definitely has a kind of, I don't want to say long-winded, but she has a very longitudinal way of writing, I guess, where, instead of contributing what you call a short story, she's almost contributing like novellas. The Lamia's Tale in this book, in volume 13, is quite long, and the story that she co-writes with Melinda Snodgrass is quite long as well, and her Tor.com story is one of the longest Tor.com entries. I'm pretty sure. I haven't done a word count on all of them, but she writes about an ace character called the Candle, and it's long. It's like it feels almost like a book, but it's great. Like it doesn't really feel like she's being self-indulgent. I mean, she's really using the big word count to really get you invested in these characters. And the Lamia's Tale is really striking because Joan Van Rensselaer is a Nat. At least for most of the story, she's not an ace nor a joker. It's established early on that she has the Wildcards virus, but it hasn't expressed yet. But she's just a normal person, and really most of the characters that we see in the Lamia's Tale are just normal people. There aren't a lot of aces and jokers to be seen, and it's a testament, I think, to her talent that it's a really compelling story, even though anyone reading Wildcards is reading it for those science fictional elements, and for a good portion of the Lamia's Tale there aren't any. It's really it's all just drama and suspense with just normal people having just normal human emotional interactions and intrigues, except for that Puppet Man cameo that I mentioned. But it's really good. I've always really liked it. I just find she just creates this very compelling character in the person of Joan Van Rensselaer, to the point where when you get to the ending, you're really invested in the sort of major twist that sort of happens at the end. I'm a big fan of her Wildcards work, and I hope that she will continue to contribute to Wildcards. That Tor.com story that she did is pretty recent. I think it just was published online back in like 2021 or maybe 2020, pretty recently, which suggests to me that she's not. It's not impossible that she could keep on contributing to Wildcards, even though there was a pretty long. It's like she contributed some stories in 94, 95, and then didn't contribute any stories to Wildcards for 25 years, and then now she's back, which I guess is not totally unusual with such a longitudinal series. William F. Wu, there's probably a similar distance. But anyway, I'm kind of digressing. I guess my point is just that I like that some of these Wildcards authors from the 80s and 90s who haven't contributed for years, or maybe had not contributed for years, and then are sort of suddenly back in the 2020s. It's a good sign, because in the case of people like William F. Wu or Laura J. Mixon, I'm a big fan, and it's great to see them back. Yeah, and her story sort of continues the thread. It does work kind of in tandem with Kevin Andrew Murphy's story, because Kevin Andrew Murphy introduces the whole intrigues involving the Kennedy family and with Marilyn Monroe, and also the sort of Marilyn Monroe connection to the Card Sharks and Pan Rudo, and then all those characters kind of come back in the Lamia's Tale, with the Robert F. Kennedy assassination being significant, and Marilyn Monroe being involved, and Pan Rudo, and both of the Pan Rudo, Marilyn Monroe, their connections to each other, and how they both connect to the Card Sharks, and et cetera, et cetera. So those two stories definitely work kind of in tandem with each other, I think. Cursum Perficio and the Lamia's Tale. And those are the two stories that round out the book, and then Stephen Lee does the climax to his interstitial, and then it kind of ends with Hannah Davis. She's definitely sort of broken the conspiracy. Well, she's broken the conspiracy at least to her own satisfaction, but now it's like, okay, what does she do with this information? Who can she take it to that will believe her? And that's kind of where the book leaves off, and it leaves off on a great cliffhanger. For anyone who might be watching this who has become a Wildcards fan recently and is reading all the Tor volumes and is now just waiting for Tor to release the 3 Card Sharks books, I'm trying not to be too spoilery because I realize these are the books that are most likely not to have been read by some Wildcards fans. So I apologize if I've already spoiled too much, but I will say, don't let yourself be spoiled on the ending of this one if you haven't yet. I would even say when you're reading it, when you get to the last page, I would even go so far as to cover, this is the last page of the book, and I would say, like, do this as you're reading it. Like, as soon as you get to the last page, just slam your hand down on the bottom so that you can't read the last sentence, because this one keeps you guessing right up until the last sentence of the book. And to this day, I hate myself. I remember it so vividly as a 15-year-old reading the last page, and I couldn't wait, and my eyes flicked down to the last line, and I spoiled myself. And I wish I hadn't, because it's a great last line. It might even give you the chills, the goosebumps, because it's a damn good last line. So if you can, at all costs, if you can avoid being spoiled on how this book ends, avoid it. That's book 13. I always try not to blab too much, but I just can't help it, particularly with this one, because it is a favorite. Truly top tier for me. At this point, I would say, if you were to ask, at this point in the series, like the very top favorite books, I would say Volume 2 is huge favorite. 6 and 7 are both favorites, and then 13. Those would be like my Mount Rushmore at this point. Obviously, as we get further down the line, some other books are also pretty high up there. But as far as like in these early days, in these in the sort of that first phase of Wildcards from 1 to 15, yeah, my Mount Rushmore would probably be 2, 6, 7, and 13. So take that for what it's worth. It's really a favorite of mine. I've reread it many times. It's one of the ones I've reread actually more than some of the other ones. Just because I just find the prose and the individual stories just endlessly entertaining. I think every author is at their best. I just love the way it's structured, and to me it's a real high point. It was a pleasure to talk about it. Hope you enjoyed listening to me talk about it, and next time we'll move on to Volume 14.
So my honey and me go to a counselor to try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing, but before we get going, may I highly recommend Card Sharks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.